2009 is the 200th anniversary of Darwin's birth and the 150th anniversary of the publication of The Origin of Species, in which Darwin explained his theory of evolution. The impact of this theory in the biological sciences is comparable to the work of Galileo and Einstein in physics. The basic framework of the theory continues to guide biological research today, although the discovery of DNA and development of new research tools has allowed increasingly detailed and complex exploration of the evolutionary process. Yet even with all our current knowledge, researchers remain indebted to Darwin and impressed by his powers of observation and scientific reasoning. Darwin was a gentleman scientist, and scientific discussions in Victorian England were conducted through letters and in drawing rooms over a proper cup of tea. Here we give modern scientists an opportunity to participate in that tradition and share their thoughts on evolutionary theory with the first person who was able to clearly and convincingly explain how evolution occurs.
So I'm Kathleen Smith, and I'm a professor at Duke University, and I'm also the director of the National Evolutionary Synthesis Center. What I would ask Darwin, if I had a chance to sit down with Darwin, is to ask him how he went about constructing his argument. Because obviously the thoughts in it, the ideas in it are world-changing. The prose is glorious, if you like florid Victorian prose. But the structure of the argument in the book, and this is my copy of the book, which I've taught from years, is a wonderful example of a scientific argument. And we all know it took him 20 years to write the book. And I'd be curious to know how much time in that 20 years he was figuring out, okay, what order and how I'm going to present the argument. At the time, there were two ideas about how one does science. One was where you set out first principles, a very Newtonian view, and derive laws from that. The other idea was, well, you take a lot of different phenomena, and from that phenomena, you try to combine them all under a unifying theory. And the wonderful thing about the book, The Origin of Species, that Darwin did, is that he does both. He sort of starts with first principles. His first chapter is domestication under animals. And everyone's familiar with variation in pigeons. Everyone's familiar with how farmers breed for milk production. So he starts off with very specific principles. And then he takes those to general laws. And he starts with these first principles, these very common principles, and then he derives the law of natural selection. And it isn't until he's taking us through all these principles that he actually then talks about evolution. So that's the first part of the book. The second part of the book is this consilience, this pulling together. So he talks about the fossil record, he talks about biogeography, he talks about anatomy and physiology. He talks about every phenomena, every science that people understand, and shows how this is all explained by this theory of natural selection and by evolution. So it's a wonderful balancing of those two. At the same time, he deals with the sort of modern view of science that a scientific theory has to be refutable. And he has in there, if anyone could show this, my theory would be refuted. So it's a very sophisticated view of the philosophy of science. And I would be really curious to see how much time, how much effort, what are his rough drafts, what did he cross out, how did he outline it, to really construct not only the perfect idea, but the perfect presentation of a theory in terms of the arguments and a very sophisticated view of the philosophy of science. That's what I'd talk to him about.
Happy birthday, Mr. Darwin, and I'm very glad to be talking to you on your 200th birthday. My name is Ganesh, and I'm a population geneticist. So in your times there was no concept of a gene, but genes are now recognized to be the units of inheritance in biology, and then they were discovered since your time. And then I'm very happy to say that, like, most of your predictions have held true, even though you did not know the modes of inheritance during your time. So, but what population genetics means is that it is a study of descent with modification. So genes are these units of inheritance, and we study how biological variation is inherited from generation to generation, and how the pattern of biological variation actually changes from generation to generation, and doing all this in a precisely mathematically quantified way. So what that allows us to do is to, first of all, it allows us to actually start from the present and use these mathematical models to go back into the past and understand how life on Earth was, how biological variation was in the past. And the second thing is that, like, having these mathematical models allow us to precisely quantify how much we know and what we don't know, and quantify the uncertainty. And so I'm very glad to be I'm very glad to be studying biological variation, and I've, like most biologists or most evolutionary biologists, I've also been inspired by your work. And one of the most instructive things to me about the origin of species is the emphasis on population sizes as a determinant of how new species are formed. And I think that while in the last 150 years since your book was published, we have understood a lot about the modes of inheritance. We have collected a lot more data than your times, and we have developed many new methods and mathematical methods of quantifying or modeling evolution and quantifying our uncertainty. But I think it is still not known for sure how population sizes determine the number of species that might exist on different continents or different climates, or among different taxonomic groups. So one of my main interests or obsessions is to actually see if I can prove that population sizes actually determine a biological variation, or like at least the number of species to a large extent. So the question is a very difficult question, and one of the difficulties is that we have collected more data, but then we still have not collected enough data to answer that question at a very large scale. So we have to collect a lot more data from different continents, from different taxonomic groups, and our mathematical models are very good, but then but in extrapolating mathematical models to go way back in the past, I mean, they don't work that well when you extrapolate them way back in the past. So we need to actually figure out how to make better models that allow us to actually go way back in the past. And I think my hope is that we will be making progress on these two fronts in the coming time, and my hope is that we will more clearly see how population sizes are very important in determining biological variations at all scales.
Okay. Well, Charles Darwin, I'm amazed to be here with you. I'm Daniel P. Faith. I'm at the Australian Museum, and I've just flown in from Sydney. I'm feeling awfully jet lagged, but it's just good to be here with you. Knowing I was going to meet with you, I went back to The Origin of Species, which I'm pleased to say is now online. So more and more people than ever are going to be reading that great book. I think one of the interesting things about that book for me, and going back and looking at it again, was I realized there's only one figure in that entire book. And that one figure in the book is your depiction, as you well know, of what we now call a phylogenetic tree. And I went back and read all that material on it, and it was just fascinating because, in a way, it re-inspires me about the work we're doing now in trying to link phylogeny to the biodiversity crisis. I think the way you discussed it in terms of the value of diversity for a species or for a taxonomic group was interesting, because as a biodiversity conservation biologist, we're looking at it that way more and more, but we're also looking at it in terms of the value of that diversity for humans. And it's interesting, and I wonder if in this conversation with you, I guess I would ask you whether in any way you could have anticipated the kind of good news, bad news situation we're in what we currently call the biodiversity crisis. The good news is that we appreciate, starting with the kind of tree thinking that you introduced in your writings. We appreciate the rich diversity that we can, in effect, predict by looking at phylogeny and by doing a better job at inferring phylogenetic patterns. But the bad news there is that even as we do that, we become more and more aware that branches are dropping off the tree. And I think as a biodiversity person, that interests me. The question I would ask you, in thinking back to that passage that you wrote in The Origin of Species and talking about the natural process not only of diversification and producing new species, but the process of extinction, could you have anticipated at all the situation we're in now, where the current estimate is that humans have inflicted an extinction rate on plants and animals that is approximately 100 times what has been estimated as the natural extinction rate? It's an astounding thing, and that's the question I would put to you.
I'm Todd Vision. I'm associate professor at University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, and I'm also associate director of informatics at the Evolutionary Synthesis Center. And if I had a chance to talk to you today, I would be really interested to know what your take is on the developments that have taken place in the understanding of your theory since the 19th century. As scientists, as I'm sure you appreciate, it's very difficult to know how your impact will be seen decades, much less centuries, from when you do your work. And you must have had more than most scientists an inkling that what you were writing about was going to have quite an impact on not just biology, but all of Western thought. But you couldn't have anticipated, surely, the tremendous advances that have happened, particularly in genetics and molecular biology, developmental biology, and our understanding of how organisms function at a molecular level in the past more than a century. And now that we can see at that very, very fine scale, there are all sorts of mechanisms that are seen to act that you couldn't have foreseen or couldn't have accounted for with the knowledge that you had in the day. So it's interesting to see now how your name is associated with all of evolutionary theory, which sometimes equated with Darwinism, when in fact much of what we know about evolution, although inspired and launched by your work, would be very exotic to you now. To what extent do you today see the richness of mechanisms that are happening at this very fine molecular level that aren't really natural selection, that aren't really sexual selection? Do you feel comfortable thinking of them as Darwinism? Or do you think of them, say, the same way that a physicist would talk about Newtonian mechanics being what could be understood to happen given the understanding of the day for Newton? And now we know that that's an approximation. We know how good of approximation is. With evolution, when we go below the organismal level, do you feel comfortable having your name attributed to what's going on, even though you had nothing to say on it back then?
Hello, Mr. Darwin. It's really a pleasure to be here with you. I'm Barbara Schaller from Washington University, and I've made my life's work studying evolution. So I have some questions for you that really have been very, very interesting to me, and I've been dying to get your opinion about them. First is you had no idea how heredity works at all. And my question is, how much were you bothered by that you didn't know the mechanism of inheritance? Because really the study of evolution now is the study of how genes are passed down from one individual to another and how they are assimilated in populations and how they're changed. And it just seems remarkable to me that you were able to conceive of the idea of natural selection without understanding any genetics at all. Okay. Question number 2. In some of your books, you talk about pollination, And one of the things that's been remarkable to so many of us in evolution is the breadth of your work, everything from guinea pigs to orchid pollination. And in your books, you talk a little bit about hybridization. And I wonder, while you were doing this work, if you had a notion of how important hybridization was in the evolution of plants. I wonder when you went to South America and to the Galapagos, when you studied plants and looked at the close relatives, if you saw morphological evidence of hybridization, and did that give you an idea that plants were hybridizing that much? The final question that I have for you is about Wallace, your competitor in natural selection. And what I want to know is, he clearly came up with the same idea of natural selection, and he was certainly an independent individual. Were you really threatened by him? Did you feel some collaboration? Did you use some of his work? How did the dynamics between the two of you work out?
Thanks so much for taking the time to meet with me today. I thought that getting together over tea might be a good idea, as I understand that tea is pretty important where you came from, and that your father and grandfather even did a little experiment to try to figure out just how many iron filings really were in the tea that you were buying. My name's Brian Sidlauskas. I'm a scientist here at the National Evolutionary Synthesis Center in Durham, North Carolina, where I study the biodiversity and the evolution of tropical fishes. Fishes are, of course, one of the most marvelously diverse groups of animals on the planet, and I'm a biodiversity scientist. So I really wanted to ask you about your concept of the tangled bank that you wrote about in The Origin, where you conceptualized and thought about just how many different types of organisms live on the planet that are all crowded together in an assemblage. And I was wondering whether, when you wrote that, if you had any idea just how many different species we would end up discovering on our planet. We're up to about 1.8 million and counting. And even within the group of animals that I know best, the fishes, we know about 30,000 different species, with almost 7,000 of those discovered in the last 20 years, and about 400 of them just last year. So the amount of diversity we're discovering on the planet just continues to snowball. And I was wondering just if you had any concept of that when you were writing that a while back. I also wanted to talk to you about morphology, which is an area of biology that particularly interests me. And I wanted to let you know that even in this genetic age, we're still making marvelous discoveries using the anatomy and the shape of organisms. And that ranges from discovering the genetics and the developmental underpinnings of some of the shape changes that you wrote about, to understanding how we can link shape and anatomy with your concept of the tree of life, and using what we know about the distribution of traits or of how different animals build their bodies to look back in time and understand something about how evolution works. Does it go forward in fits and starts? Does it work on a continuous basis? Do we see animals moving off in evolutionary trajectories and climbing adaptive landscapes? There's wonderful things that we can do by linking morphology and your concept of the tree. So I just wanted to let you know that we're really continuing to do that. Morphology is certainly alive and very, very vibrant, and certainly important to me in my own work. So that's basically it. I'm really just glad that we had this chance to sit down together, and I really wanted to let you know that the discipline that you started, evolutionary biology, has really been just had a tremendous impact on me in my own life. It's launched a field in which I am now finding a career and really making a life for myself out of. Whether I'm studying the fishes, or I'm studying evolution, or I'm studying biodiversity, it's all linked together in what you started, and I wanted to say thank you. So cheers and happy birthday.
Oh, well, Mr. Darwin, thank you very much for inviting me to tea today. My name's George Gilchrist. I'm a evolutionary biologist at the College of William & Mary. My research is on how organisms adapt to a changing climate, and I'm interested in that on any time scale, daily cycles of change or seasonal changes. Or this is something that you probably don't know much about, but back in your day, people started burning a lot of fossil fuels. Now, 100 or so years later, we find that the gases from those fossil fuels, particularly carbon dioxide and methane, have changed the composition of our atmosphere, and it's getting warmer and warmer here on Earth. So we've launched a big experiment on evolution of life on Earth. Can life adapt to a warming world? And that's what much of my research is about. I use geographic variation and introduce species transfer to new habitats to follow what happens. And what we can see is evolution in our time, evolution in front of our eyes. And that's something I want to ask you about today. So much of your case for evolution was built looking at changes due to selective breeding, artificial selection. And you must have been aware, of course, that the rate at which you can change traits is very, very fast. Within a few generations, you can get things like your bowler pigeons, for example, that don't seem to be found in the natural world. But much of your thinking and your writing about evolution and the rate of evolution tends to be that it's more slow in nature. What we've discovered recently is that, in fact, it can go very fast. And one of the things I'd wonder is if it ever occurred to you that maybe the same kind of rates of evolution you see under artificial selection, maybe you would see those same kinds of rates of evolution in natural populations. It was a great talking to you, and thanks for all the work you've done for us.
Well, hi, I'm Marc Lajeunesse, and I'm a postdoc here at NESCent. And the project that I'm involved in is trying to understand how evolutionary history introduces bias into experimentation and how we review these experiments. But what I'm really interested in are parasites. And parasites have had sort of this awkward history with evolutionary biology in that, well, Peter Price argued in 1980 that there wasn't really a cohesive body of theory explaining the diversity of parasites. But since then, there's been incredible inroads in advancing ecological and evolutionary principles to explain diversity in parasites. So what I would like to ask Darwin is what he thought about parasitism and parasites. I guess in The Origin, he doesn't really discuss parasites at all. He does in passing, like a parasite on a tiger's back or something like that, always trying to highlight different types of interactions occurring. My impression is if I would ask his impression on parasites, it would kind of make him nervous a bit, because he sort of suffered an illness throughout his whole life, right? Sort of a debilitating illness where and doctors weren't really able to diagnose what his problem was. And apparently it was related to nervousness a bit, and it influenced his interactions with other scientists. And that, you know, he would go to a social event and then he would get nervous, and then maybe he would vomit a bit or something like that, and then he would associate it to this disease that he had. So maybe, you know, asking him about parasites probably wouldn't be a great idea, I guess.
My name is Susan Alberts, and I'm a biologist at Duke University. And I work on the behavioral ecology of large mammals. Specifically, I study baboons and elephants in East Africa. And I'm very interested in how these animals use behavior to solve the problems their environment presents to them, and how evolution has shaped those solutions. And if I had the opportunity to have tea with Darwin, I think there are two questions I would like to ask him. One I think I know the answer to, and the other I don't. I would first ask him what he would most like to know of the things that have happened since his death. And I think that the answer to that would be he would like to know about the mechanism of inheritance. And the other thing I would ask him is whether he thinks, I would pose for him the famous question that Steve Gould posed, which is, if we started the tape of evolution over again, would we come out at the same place we are? Would the world look like it looks today? And I don't know what Darwin would say to that, so I'd be very interested to hear what he would have to say. The things I would most want to tell Darwin about are the enormous advances in evolutionary biology since his death. At the time of his death, natural selection as a mechanism of evolution was not universally accepted, mostly because of the mechanism of inheritance problem. And since then, there's been, and between the time of his death and the modern synthesis, it languished. But between the modern synthesis and now, there's been a remarkable resurgence in appreciation for and understanding of the power of natural selection. And I think Darwin would want to know that. That's remarkable and beautiful. And we also appreciate, and I'd want him to know this, the extent to which his vision was so fully realized. Among the biologists of his time, even those who accepted natural selection didn't rise to the level that he did of understanding its implications. Even though he got some things wrong, it was remarkable the clarity with which he saw the importance of natural selection and how it works in detail, even without a mechanism of inheritance.
I'm Mike Anslin. I'm an evolutionary biologist and population geneticist at Colorado State University, and currently a sabbatical scholar here at NESCent in Durham, North Carolina. My research over the years has been on parasitoid wasps and their evolutionary biology. More recently, I've gotten into genetics and ecology of infectious diseases, and especially the plague pathogen. This is the bacterium that caused the Black Death in Europe, was introduced into North America about a century ago, has spread into wild populations of rodents, where we study it actually in black-tailed prairie dog populations on the Great Plains, west of Fort Collins, Colorado, which is where I'm from currently. So I have 3 questions for Mr. Darwin. The first one has to do is, when was the idea of natural selection really formed in his mind? I know that it's in his notes, and I know that there's been a lot of written about it, but I'm really curious whether the idea developed while he was still on the Beagle, shortly after he got back, or whether it really took until, for instance, discoveries were made about things like his specimens of the Galapagos finches, of whether they were a closely related group or a diverse group, and of course it was found that they were a closely related group that had diversified. So when was that idea of natural selection really fully formed in his mind? The second thing I'd ask is about how much were his ideas of evolution counter to the normative ideas of the Victorian times of order and everything in its place, and particularly about the role of chance in evolution. Adaptation is a almost directed process, but we know now that evolution has a lot of the role of chance in it, that you have both changes in populations that arise because of chance events, but then also larger themes in the history of life that have occurred, things that have occurred because of chance events, and history takes a different direction. The third question has really got to do more with Darwin's personal life, and I know he was a good colleague of Thomas Huxley, who I actually found to be a fascinating character. And though it's lovely to have tea with Mr. Darwin, he wouldn't have been my choice actually for having dinner. I think I would much prefer to have had dinner with Thomas Huxley. And the thing I would ask is, Huxley's famous for 2 quips. One is for saying how extraordinarily stupid of him not to have thought of it when the idea of natural selection was published. And the second one was his famous exchange with the Archbishop of Wilberforce in one of the first debates about evolution, where he was asked whether he was related to the ape on his mother's or his father's side, and professed that he would prefer to be related to an ape on both sides if this was the level of discourse that we were going to have. And so my question would be, what's the third most clever thing that Thomas Huxley ever said? And when did he say it? And what did he say it about?
Hi, I'm Steve Benner. I'm coming from Gainesville, Florida, where I work at the Foundation for Applied Molecular Evolution. What I would like to say to you, if I had the opportunity to, having brought you forward in time, is to answer one of the questions that must have been burning in your minds when you completed the work and saw the arguments that were presented against it, especially those from the physicists. There was a gentleman at the time named Lord Kelvin, who is actually a very respected physicist, so much so that he has his name associated with the absolute temperature scale. Today we refer not to degrees centigrade or to degrees Fahrenheit, but rather to the degree Kelvin. He had pointed out that although you had rocks and thought that you needed 300 million years at least to deposit the rocks, Kelvin was smart enough to know physics and to know that even if the sun was made out of the highest grade coal, it couldn't have burned for more than about 1,000, maybe 6,000 years. In fact, the estimates for the age of the Earth based on how long the sun could have lived are actually quite close to the ones that come out of the Bible, even though the Hebrew fathers presumably also did not know physics. Kelvin was very much interested in showing how he could get 6,000 years out of the sun, and there were meteorites falling to the sun from inner orbits between the Earth and the sun, was how he proposed to get the energy that was necessary to keep the Earth alive for about 6,000 years. But he could not get 1 million, and he could certainly not get 300 million, which is what Charles Lyell was arguing from the rock record, or what you had seen when you climbed into the Andes in South America. Well, guess what? There's a solution to this problem 150 years after the publication of The Origin of Species, and that solution is based on physics as well, but a kind of physics that Kelvin could not have known about. Specifically, it turns out that energy can come from matter. Mass can be converted to energy. The sun actually produces energy in that way. Who would have thunk? I mean, this is quite a remarkable concept. So I thought you might like to know that, because that solves the one big obstacle to origins of species and long times that are needed to convert one species to another.
My name is Carl Zimmer, and I'm a science writer, and I've written some books and a number of articles about evolution. And I guess if I could talk to Charles Darwin, I would be curious to know what he thought about bacteria and viruses, things that you can't see with the naked eye, because I've looked through his writings and he has just about nothing to say about them. And I know that at the time he was, at the time he could have known about them. The people were doing a lot of work on them. And it was right around the time that Louis Pasteur was doing his research. And I just wonder why didn't he get interested in bacteria and viruses? Because today it's so obvious that they really run the show when it comes to life. If you pick up a little spoonful of dirt, you might have 10,000 species of bacteria in there. There are only 5,000 species of mammals. And viruses are probably even more genetically diverse and incredibly important just to how the whole planet works. And they're also evolving very quickly. And so I would say, was there a reason that you were avoiding them? Maybe were you just trained as an animal and plant person and that was it? And once I got a good answer to that, then I started explaining about what we know now about the microscopic world and how some of the best examples of evolution in action can be seen there, and how that's helping us to understand how life evolved in the first place. And I think he'd be surprised, because in some ways it vindicates his ideas, and in other ways it goes right against some of his most cherished beliefs. And I don't think he'd be offended. I think he'd be fascinated and want to find out more.
Happy birthday, Darwin. Happy birthday, Darwin. We're gonna party like it's 1859. Happy birthday, Darwin. Happy birthday, Darwin. We're gonna party like it's 1859.